He thought humiliating her in front of everyone would remind her who held the power, but he had no idea she had already taken it from him. The glass-walled boardroom on the 42nd floor overlooked Manhattan like a throne suspended in the sky, sunlight spilling across polished marble and reflecting off chrome edges that made everything feel sharper, colder, more unforgiving, and Charlotte Hayes stood just inside the doorway as if she didn't quite belong there anymore, her hand resting lightly against the curve of her belly beneath a simple navy dress that contrasted almost painfully with the tailored suits and designer heels. Surrounding her, the quiet hum of conversation thinning the moment someone noticed her and then another until the room shifted, subtly at first and then all at once, like a current turning beneath still water, and eyes began to follow her, assessing, remembering, judging, because they all knew who she was, or at least who she used to be, and the silence stretched just long enough to feel deliberate before a low chuckle cut through it, smooth and practiced. And she didn't have to look to know it. Was Ethan Caldwell, standing near the head of the long glass table with the same effortless confidence that had once drawn her in and then slowly dismantled her piece by piece, his suit impeccable, his posture relaxed, as if the entire room existed simply to orbit him, and when their eyes finally met it wasn't recognition that flickered there, not even surprise, but something colder, something that felt like ownership he had forgotten to relinquish. "Well," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, his voice carrying that easy charm that had always concealed the edge beneath it, "I didn't expect to see you here," and a few people shifted uncomfortably while others leaned in, sensing something unfolding, because moments like this were currency in rooms like these, and Charlotte didn't respond, not immediately, her breathing steady, her fingers resting against her stomach in a gesture so subtle it could be missed if you weren't looking for it. But he noticed, of course he noticed, and his gaze dropped for just a fraction of a second before lifting again, his smile tightening in a way that made it sharper, more deliberate. "You looked comfortable," he added, the word hanging in the air with a weight it didn't deserve and yet somehow carried anyway, coded, dismissive, familiar, the same word he had used years ago when he wanted to make her feel smaller without ever raising his voice, and there it was again, dressed up as politeness but cutting just the same, and a ripple of quiet laughter moved through the room, not loud, not overt, but enough to mark the moment, enough to define her place in it, and for a second the past pressed in, the echo of other rooms, other smiles, other carefully chosen words that had chipped away at her until there was almost nothing left, but that was before, and this was now, and she let the silence sit between them, not defensive, not reactive, just there, solid and immovable, as if it belonged to her, and somewhere behind Ethan, a stack of documents rested neatly on the table, crisp white pages waiting, unnoticed by most, but not by her, never by her, and while the room watched, expecting something, anything, an explanation, a protest, a crack in her composure, Charlotte simply took a step forward into the light, her expression calm, her eyes steady, and said nothing at all, because she didn't need to, not yet, not when the real conversation hadn't even begun. The silence did not break, it deepened, settling over the room like a thin layer of ice that no one dared to crack, and Charlotte could feel every pair of eyes measuring her, waiting for her to shrink, to apologize for existing in a space that had once been his, but she did not move back, she did not lower her gaze, she simply stood there, steady, as if the weight of their judgment could not reach her anymore, and that was what unsettled them most, because they remembered a different woman, one who used to fill the silence too quickly, who used to smooth over tension with a nervous smile or a soft explanation, but that woman was not standing here now, and Ethan felt it, even if he could not name it, the subtle shift that made his confidence sharpen into something more performative, more deliberate, as he pushed off the edge of the table and took a few slow steps toward her, each one echoing faintly against the marble floor. "You should have called," he said, his tone light, almost conversational, but loud enough for the room to follow. "I could have saved you the trouble of coming all the way up here," and a few people glanced at one another, unsure whether to laugh, unsure whether they were witnessing a private exchange or something meant for display, and Charlotte noticed the hesitation, the way the room leaned toward him out of habit but did not fully commit, as if something in the air had already begun to shift, and she let her eyes move past him for just a second, toward the far end of the table where the documents rested, untouched, waiting, before returning to him, her expression unchanged, calm in a way that did not invite conversation but did not avoid it either, and that was when he saw it more clearly, the absence of reaction, the lack of urgency, and it irritated him in a way he could not quite conceal. "Still quiet, I see," he continued, a faint edge slipping into his voice now. "That was always your strategy, was it not? Let everyone else do the talking while you just stood there and. The last two words lingered, heavier than the rest, because they carried history, because they were meant to remind her of who she had been under his influence, but Charlotte did not flinch, not outwardly, her breathing slow, controlled, the soft rise and fall beneath her hand grounding her in a way nothing else could, and for a moment, just a moment, the noise of the room faded behind the steady rhythm of her own pulse, the quiet certainty that had been built not in one dramatic moment but in countless small ones, late nights and early mornings, decisions made without him, without anyone, and when the present rushed back in, it did not shake her, it settled around her, contained, manageable, and someone near the corner of the table cleared their throat, glancing at a watch, a subtle reminder that there was supposed to be a purpose to this meeting beyond whatever tension was unfolding, but Ethan ignored it, his attention fixed on her as if he needed a response to restore the balance. He was used to, you know, he said, softer now but no less cutting, this is not really your world anymore, and that was the line, the one he expected to land, the one that had always worked before, drawing a boundary he controlled, defining where she belonged and where she did not, but this time the word seemed to hang without impact, like something spoken into empty space, and Charlotte felt it as clearly as he did, the way the room did not fully accept his version of reality, the way doubt had begun to thread itself through the edges of his certainty, and she shifted her weight slightly, just enough to signal presence, just enough to remind everyone that she was not leaving, and somewhere behind them, a man in a dark suit adjusted a folder, flipping it open with quiet precision, his eye scanning the first page where a name was printed in clean, decisive letters, a name that had already begun to change everything even before it was spoken aloud, and still, Charlotte said nothing. The man at the far end of the table did not raise his voice, yet the simple sound of a folder closing carried through the room with a precision that cut deeper than any insult, and Charlotte felt the shift before anyone else seemed to register it, the subtle tightening of attention, the way conversations died not out of courtesy but out of instinct, because something was about to happen and no one wanted to miss it, and Ethan, still standing just a few feet from her, exhaled through his nose. With a quiet impatience, as if the moment had already stretched longer than he intended, we are actually in the middle of something important, he said, turning slightly toward the table, his tone reclaiming authority, reclaiming control. If you are here for attention, Charlotte, I am afraid you picked the wrong room, and this time a few heads nodded, the old rhythm reasserting itself, the hierarchy he had built settling back into place, but only partially, because the hesitation remained thin but present, and Charlotte noticed it in the way no one fully returned to their seats, in the way the man with the folder did not move away, in the way the air itself seemed to hold its breath, and she let her gaze drift again, not to Ethan, not to the faces watching her, but to the reflection in the glass wall behind him, the city stretching out in clean lines and distant motion, a reminder of scale, of distance, of how small this room truly was compared to everything beyond it, and when she looked back, her expression had not changed, but something in it had settled into place, something quiet and unshakable, and Ethan caught it, just for a second, a flicker of something he could not quite interpret, and it made him press forward instead of stepping back. You always had a talent for showing up at the wrong time, he added, a faint smile returning, sharper now, but I suppose that has not changed, and there it was again. The attempt to define her, to fix her in a version of the past that suited him, and for a moment the room leaned with him, waiting for her to be that version, waiting for her to confirm it, but Charlotte did not move, did not speak, and that absence began to feel less like passivity and more like refusal, and the man at the end of the table finally stepped forward, his presence quiet but deliberate, placing the folder down in front of the empty chair near Ethan, the leather edge meeting glass with a soft, controlled sound, and he cleared his throat, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to redirect attention. Mr. Caldwell, he said, his voice measured, professional, the kind of voice that did not seek permission to be heard. We are ready to proceed, and Ethan turned toward him with a slight frown, irritation flickering across his features at the interruption. Then proceed, he replied, dismissive, waving a hand as if to move things along, as if this were all exactly as expected, and the man nodded once, opening the folder with careful precision, revealing neatly arranged documents that caught the light in clean, unforgiving lines, and for the first time since she had entered the room, Charlotte shifted her hand from her side to rest fully over her stomach, a small, instinctive motion that grounded her in the present, in the reason she had come, in the reason she had endured every look, every word, every assumption, and as the pages were turned, the soft sound of paper sliding against paper seemed Louder than it should have been, amplified by the silence that had settled over the room, and somewhere behind Ethan, someone leaned forward, trying to catch a glimpse of the top page, where a name sat printed in bold, unmistakable clarity, a name that had already been filed, approved, and sealed. Long before this moment ever began, and as the man's finger traced the first line, preparing to read, Ethan straightened slightly, his confidence returning in full, unaware that the ground beneath him had already begun to shift, and Charlotte, still silent, finally allowed the faintest breath to leave her lips, steady, controlled, as if everything had been leading exactly to this point. The man's voice did not rise, yet every word seemed to land with deliberate precision as he began to read. This meeting concerns the finalization of a controlling interest acquisition in Caldwell Dynamics, and the word settled into the room like something heavy and irreversible, drawing every ounce of attention toward the table, toward the documents, toward the quiet authority that had replaced the earlier tension. And Ethan's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, his shoulders straightening. As a faint smile returned, the kind that came from familiarity, from believing he understood exactly how this would unfold, because in his mind, this was the moment that confirmed his position, his control, his inevitable victory, and he clasped his hands loosely in front of him, glancing briefly at the others as if to acknowledge the significance of what they were about to witness. But Charlotte remained still, her presence unchanged, her silence now less about restraint and more about timing. And as the man turned the first page, the soft slide of paper echoed again, measured, intentional. The acquiring party has completed all necessary due diligence and secured majority stake through consolidated shares over the past quarter, he continued, his tone even, unhurried, and a subtle ripple moved through the room. A few exchanged looks, a slight narrowing of eyes as people began to process what that meant, not fully yet, not completely, but enough to feel that something was not aligning with expectation. And Ethan's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second before returning, tighter now, more controlled, as previously communicated. He interjected smoothly, stepping closer to the table, "We are looking forward to a strategic partnership that benefits all parties involved," his voice reclaiming space, attempting to guide the narrative back into familiar territory, but the man did not respond to the interruption, did not acknowledge it at all. He simply continued. Turning another page with the same calm precision, the majority stakeholder will assume immediate executive authority upon signature, and this time the silence sharpened, no longer passive, no longer neutral, but charged with something closer to anticipation, and Charlotte felt it move through the room like a current, the moment beginning to tilt, slowly, almost imperceptibly, but undeniably, and she shifted her weight again, grounding herself, her hand still resting over her stomach, the steady rhythm beneath her palm a quiet reminder of what mattered, of what could not be taken from her. And Ethan noticed the shift in the room, the subtle withdrawal of certainty. And it irritated him, not because he understood it yet, but because he felt it slipping. "Let us not drag this out," he said, a sharper edge breaking through now, his eyes flicking briefly toward Charlotte before returning to the man. "We all know why we are here," and for a moment, it seemed as though the room might follow him again, might settle back into the version of events he presented, but then the man finally paused, his hand resting flat against the open document, his gaze lifting, not to Ethan, but slightly past him, aligning instead with the still figure standing just beyond his shoulder, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a different weight, not louder, not more forceful, but definitive in a way that left no room for interpretation. "Yes," he said quietly, "we do," and he turned the final page, revealing the signature line, clean and waiting, and beneath it, printed in bold, unmistakable letters, a name that had not yet been spoken aloud, a name that existed in the space between recognition and realization. And as the room leaned in, drawn by something they could not yet fully grasp, Charlotte's gaze remained steady, her expression unchanged, but inside, everything had already aligned, every step, every silence, every moment leading here, and Ethan, standing just inches away from the truth, still believed the story belonged to him, still believed the ending had already been written, and that was the only thing he had not yet realized he no longer controlled. For a fraction of a second, no one moved, no one spoke, and even the city beyond the glass seemed to pause as if it, too, was waiting for the moment to fully arrive, and Charlotte could feel it in the stillness, the exact point where everything balanced between what had been and what was about to be revealed, and the man's hand rested beside the signature line, steady, patient, not urging, not rushing, simply allowing the truth to surface at its own pace, while Ethan's eyes dropped, almost absent-mindedly at first, scanning the page with the casual confidence of someone who expected to see confirmation of his own control, his own authority, but that confidence did not last, because the moment recognition flickered, it did not settle, it fractured. His gaze tightening, his expression shifting in a way that was subtle but unmistakable, as if the words in front of him had rearranged themselves into something he did not understand, and he leaned in slightly, as though proximity might change what was written, might correct what his mind refused to accept, and a quiet murmur began at the edges of the room, not loud enough to interrupt, but present enough to signal that others were beginning to see it too, the name, printed clearly, undeniably, where no one expected it to be, and Charlotte did not look at the page. She did not need to. She had seen it long before this moment, had signed versions of it in rooms far quieter than this one, had watched it move from possibility to certainty piece by piece, and now she simply stood, her breathing even, her posture unchanged, as if the weight of what was happening did not need to be carried, because it had already been resolved. And Ethan straightened abruptly, the movement sharper than anything he had done so far, his voice coming out lower than before. Controlled but strained in a way that had not been there moments ago. "This is not correct," he said, not to anyone in particular, but to the room itself, as if the collective presence might validate his objection, might restore the version of reality he understood, but no one responded immediately, because they were still reading, still processing, still realizing that the majority stake he believed was secured had already been transferred, already consolidated, already claimed, and not by a faceless entity or a distant firm, but by someone standing in the room, someone he had just dismissed, someone he had just tried to reduce to a memory, and the man at the table did not argue, did not defend the document, he simply turned it slightly, angling it so there was no ambiguity left, no room for misinterpretation, and when he spoke, his voice was the same as before, calm, precise, final. "The documentation has been verified and filed," he said, his eyes lifting now, meeting Charlotte's directly for the briefest moment before returning to Ethan. "All signatures are in place," and the silence that followed was different from before, heavier, more defined, no longer waiting but settling, and Charlotte felt it move through her, not as triumph, not as relief, but as completion, the quiet end of something that had once consumed her. And she took a single step forward, closing the distance between herself and the table, her hand leaving her side to rest gently against the edge of the glass, her reflection merging with the lines of the city beyond, and still she said nothing, because there was nothing left to explain, nothing left to prove, and Ethan, standing across from her, stared at the page as if it might change if he looked long enough, as if the name would disappear, but it did not. It remained exactly where it was. Steady, permanent, and for the first time since she had walked into the room, the balance between them shifted completely, not with a word, not with a confrontation, but with a single undeniable fact, and Charlotte Hayes, who had once been dismissed as someone who did not belong in this world anymore, had already claimed it without ever asking for permission. The word settled into the room without needing to be spoken, ownership, and Charlotte could feel it in the way the air shifted around her, no longer pressing in but opening, as if the space itself had begun to recognize her presence in a way it never had before, and Ethan's hand hovered just above the table, not quite touching the document, as though contact would make it real in a way he was not prepared to accept, his jaw tightening, his gaze moving from the printed name to her and back again. Searching for something that would explain it, undo it, reduce it to a misunderstanding he could correct. "This is not possible," he said again, quieter this time, less certain, as if repeating the words might restore their meaning, but they landed differently now, not as a declaration but as a question no one felt compelled to answer, and Charlotte watched him for a moment, not with satisfaction, not with anger, but with a calm detachment that came from having already lived through the part that hurt, already endured the dismantling, the doubt, the quiet erosion of everything she once believed about herself, and what remained now was not fragile, not dependent on his recognition or denial, but steady, self-contained, and complete, and the man beside the table adjusted the papers once more, aligning them with careful precision before sliding them slightly forward, positioning the pen beside the signature line, a simple gesture that carried more weight than any speech, and the faint scratch of someone shifting in their chair broke the silence at the far end of the room, a reminder that there were witnesses here, people who had once aligned themselves with Ethan without question, who were now recalculating in real time, their expressions shifting from certainty to something more cautious, more observant, because power had a way of revealing itself without needing introduction. And Charlotte felt their attention. but it did not pull at her, did not demand anything from her, because this moment was not about them, it never had been, and Ethan finally looked up fully, his eyes meeting hers with a sharpness that bordered on disbelief. "You," he said, the single word carrying more confusion than accusation, as if he was trying to reconcile the woman in front of him with the version he had left behind, the one he believed he understood, the one he believed he had defined, but that version no longer existed. And Charlotte did not correct him, did not explain, because explanation would have required permission, and she no longer needed any, and instead she stepped closer to the table, the soft sound of her shoes against the marble floor grounding the moment in something real, something undeniable, and as she reached for the pen, her hand did not tremble, did not hesitate, it moved with the quiet certainty of someone who had already decided long ago, and for a brief second, the reflection in the glass caught her, the outline of her figure, the subtle curve of her silhouette, the city stretching endlessly behind her, and it felt like standing at the edge of something vast, something that no longer had anything to do with the past she had left behind, and Ethan did not move, did not interrupt, as if some part of him understood that whatever control he thought he held had already slipped beyond his reach, and the room watched, not with curiosity anymore, but with recognition, because they were witnessing a shift that could not be undone, and Charlotte lowered the pen to the page, the tip meeting paper with a soft, final touch, and in that quiet, controlled motion, everything that had once been taken from her was no longer something she needed to reclaim, because she had already built something greater in its place. The pen did not rush, it did not hesitate, it moved in a slow, deliberate line across the paper, each stroke measured, each letter forming with quiet certainty, and in that small, controlled motion, something far larger than ink and paper was being finalized, and the room seemed to lean into the sound, the faint scratch against the page carrying more weight than any voice that had filled the space before, and Charlotte's expression remained unchanged, her focus steady, as if nothing outside of that single line existed, as if the past, the room, and even Ethan himself had been reduced to something distant and irrelevant, and when the final letter was completed, she lifted the pen without flourish, without pause, setting it down exactly where it belonged, a simple action that marked the end of something that had once defined her, and for a moment, no one spoke, because there was nothing left to interrupt, nothing left to question. The reality of the situation settling in with a quiet finality that no one could deny, and Ethan stood there, still, his gaze fixed on the signature as if it might shift, as if it might undo itself under the pressure of his disbelief, but it did not, it remained exactly as it was, permanent, unyielding, and he exhaled slowly, the sound almost inaudible, but enough to break the silence that had taken hold of him. "You planned this," he said, the words low, controlled, but lacking the sharpness they once carried, because they were no longer an accusation, they were an acknowledgement of something he had failed to see, something he had underestimated, and Charlotte did not look up immediately, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the table, grounding herself in the present, in the moment that had taken so long to arrive, and when she finally lifted her gaze, there was no triumph in her eyes, no satisfaction, only a calm clarity that felt almost unfamiliar in its simplicity, and she met his stare without flinching, without offering him the reaction he seemed to be searching for, and that absence was louder than anything she could have said, because it confirmed what he was only just beginning to understand, that this had never been about him, not anymore, and the man beside them closed the folder with quiet precision, the soft sound echoing like a final note, sealing what had already been done, and he inclined his head slightly toward Charlotte, a gesture of acknowledgement that carried no spectacle, no ceremony, only recognition, and around the room, people began to shift, not dramatically, but enough to signal that something fundamental had changed, the alignment of attention, the recalibration of respect, the quiet repositioning that followed power as it revealed itself, and Ethan noticed it, of course he noticed it, the way the room no longer orbited him in the same way, the way eyes moved past him, toward her, toward the person he had just tried to diminish, and for the first time, there was no immediate response, no quick recovery, only a pause that stretched longer than he intended, and Charlotte stepped back from the table, her movement unhurried, composed, as if the outcome had never been in question, and she let her hand fall gently back to her side before resting once more over the soft curve of her stomach, a quiet, instinctive gesture that anchored her in something far more important than anything that had just happened, and as she turned slightly toward the door, the light from the windows catching along the edges of her silhouette, it became clear in a way that required no explanation, no confirmation, that she had not just taken something from him, she had moved beyond him entirely, leaving him standing in a version of the world that no longer belonged to him. And the silence that followed her movement was not empty, it was full, filled with the realization that everything had already changed, and there was nothing left for him to reclaim. The door had not yet opened, and still the room had already let her go, the shift so complete it felt as though her presence no longer required acknowledgement, and Charlotte paused just a fraction before taking her next step, not because she hesitated, but because she could feel it, the moment settling into place behind her like something final, something that would not be undone, and the faint hum of the city beyond the glass returned, distant and steady, as if reminding her that this room, this moment, was only one part of a much larger world she now moved through on her own terms, and behind her, a chair scraped softly against the floor, breaking the stillness, followed by the low murmur of voices that had finally found permission to exist again, but none of it reached her in the same way, none of it carried the weight it once might have, because the center of gravity had shifted, and she was no longer standing within it, she had stepped beyond it, and Ethan remained where he was, his hand now resting flat against the table as if he needed the contact to steady himself, his gaze no longer fixed on the document but following her instead, tracking her movement with a focus that was sharper now, more searching, as if he was trying to understand how something so definitive had unfolded without his awareness, without his control. "Charlotte," he said, her name breaking into the space with a tone that was quieter than before, stripped of its earlier edge, and for a moment, it almost sounded unfamiliar in his own voice, as if he had not spoken it in a way that carried any real weight in a very long time, and she stopped, not turning immediately, allowing the pause to exist, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough to redefine who held it, and when she did turn, it was not fully, only enough to meet his gaze over her shoulder, her expression unchanged, calm, composed, but no longer distant, no longer removed, because now there was nothing left to protect, nothing left to endure, only the present, clear and unclouded, and he took a step forward, the movement hesitant in a way that would have been unthinkable before. "You could have said something," he continued, the words measured, searching for footing. "You did not have to," and the sentence trailed, unfinished, because there was no version of it that could make sense of what had already been done, and Charlotte held his gaze for a moment longer, her eyes steady, not cold, not warm, simply certain, and for the first time, she allowed herself to speak, her voice quiet, even, carrying none of the strain he might have expected, none of the emotion he might have anticipated. "I did," she said, and the simplicity of it seemed to settle more deeply than anything else, because it did not explain, it did not justify, it did not argue, it simply existed as fact, and the room, still listening, still watching, absorbed it in silence, understanding that the conversation he thought he deserved had never been the one that mattered, and she turned again, fully this time, her hand brushing lightly against the door handle before pushing it open, the movement smooth, unhurried, and as the door gave way, the light from the hallway spilled in, softer, less reflective, a different kind of space waiting beyond, and without looking back again, Charlotte stepped through, leaving the room exactly as it was, with its polished surfaces and shifting loyalties, with its quiet recalculations and lingering disbelief, and as the door closed behind her, the sound was not loud, not dramatic, but it carried a finality that echoed long after it settled, because it marked the end of something that had once defined her, and the beginning of something that no longer required anyone else to understand. The hallway felt different, quieter, the kind of quiet that did not demand anything from her, and Charlotte welcomed it without thinking, her steps steady against the muted carpet as the door behind her sealed away the last echoes of a room that had once held so much weight, and for a moment she allowed herself to breathe fully, a slow, controlled inhale that settled deep in her chest, grounding her in the present, in the reality that she had already crossed the threshold she once thought she would never reach, and the soft lighting along the corridor cast a warmer tone against the polished walls, a stark contrast to the sharp reflections of glass and steel she had just left behind, and it felt almost symbolic, though she did not dwell on it, because she had learned not to attach meaning to things that no longer needed explanation, and as she moved forward, a pair of footsteps approached from the far end, measured, familiar in their rhythm, and when she lifted her gaze, she saw him. The man who had stood at the table, now walking toward her with the same composed presence, his expression calm but not distant, and he slowed as he reached her, offering a slight nod that carried acknowledgement without intrusion. "Everything has been finalized," he said, his voice low, respectful, as if aware that this moment belonged to her and not to the transaction itself, and Charlotte met his gaze briefly, her own expression steady. "Thank you," she replied, the words simple, but carrying a weight that extended beyond courtesy, because they were not just for him, not just for what he had facilitated, but for everything that had aligned to bring her here. And he inclined his head again, understanding without needing further explanation, before stepping aside, allowing her path forward to remain uninterrupted. And as she continued down the corridor, her hand instinctively returned to rest over her stomach, the gesture soft, protective, a quiet reminder of what truly mattered. And the steady rhythm beneath her palm grounded her in a way nothing else could, because while the world she had just stepped out of was defined by contracts and control, this was something entirely different, something untouched by negotiation or power, and she let that realization settle, not as a contrast, but as a truth she carried with her. And behind her, the door remained closed, but she could almost imagine the scene inside, the recalculations, the quiet conversations, the shifting alliances that would inevitably follow. And for the first time, she did not feel the need to anticipate them, to prepare for them, because they no longer dictated her path. And as she reached the end of the hallway, the elevator doors stood open, waiting, the mirrored interior reflecting her back in a way that felt both familiar and new. And she stepped inside, the space enclosing gently around her as she pressed the button for the lobby. And as the doors began to slide shut, her reflection lingered for a moment, the outline of a woman who had once been defined by someone else's expectations, now standing entirely within her own. And the elevator began its descent, smooth and quiet, carrying her away from the height of that room and into something far more expansive, something that did not need validation or recognition to exist. And as the floors passed one by one, she did not look back, because there was nothing left behind that still belonged to her, and everything ahead was already waiting. The elevator descended in near silence, the faint hum of machinery barely noticeable beneath the steady rhythm of Charlotte's breathing, and she watched the numbers above the door change one by one, each floor passing like a quiet marker of distance, not just from the room she had left behind, but from everything that had once defined her within it. And for a moment her reflection in the mirrored walls held her attention, not out of vanity, but recognition, because she could still see traces of who she had been, the woman who once stood beside Ethan in rooms just like that, believing she was part of something stable, something shared. And the memory did not sting the way it used to, it did not tighten her chest or cloud her thoughts, it simply existed, distant and resolved, like a story she no longer needed to revisit. And as the elevator slowed, a soft chime signaled the lobby, and the doors opened to a different kind of space, one filled with movement, quiet conversations, the distant echo of footsteps across polished stone, and natural light filtering through tall glass panels that framed the city at street level, grounding everything in a way the height above never quite did. And Charlotte stepped forward, her pace unhurried, her posture steady, blending into the flow of people without drawing attention. And yet there was something about her presence that remained distinct, not because of what she wore or how she moved, but because of the quiet certainty she carried, the kind that did not need to be seen to exist. And as she crossed the lobby, a doorman held the entrance open, offering a polite nod that she returned with a brief glance, her focus already shifting beyond the building, beyond its walls. And the moment she stepped outside, the air felt different, cooler, carrying the layered sounds of the city, distant traffic, voices blending into a low, constant hum, the kind of noise that once felt overwhelming but now seemed almost grounding, as if it reminded her that life continued in every direction, unaffected by the outcome of a single room, no matter how significant it had once seemed. And she paused just long enough to take it in, the sunlight catching along the edges of nearby buildings, the movement of people passing without recognition, without expectation. And for the first time in a long time, there was no pressure attached to that anonymity, no need to prove anything, no need to be seen in a certain way, because everything that mattered had already been decided, not here, not now, but long before, in moments that no one else had witnessed. And as she moved toward the curb, a black car pulled up smoothly, the driver stepping out to open the door without needing instruction. And Charlotte hesitated for just a second, not out of uncertainty, but awareness, because stepping into that car was not just about leaving this place, it was about continuing forward into something she had built on her own, something that no longer required validation or permission. And she placed her hand lightly against the door frame before stepping inside, settling into the seat with a quiet composure that matched everything about her. And as the door closed, the outside world softened into a muted backdrop, the city still moving, still alive, but no longer pressing in. And the car began to move, merging into traffic with effortless precision, carrying her forward without hesitation. And Charlotte leaned back slightly, her hand resting once more over her stomach, her gaze shifting toward the window as the buildings passed, each one reflecting fragments of light and motion, and in that steady, uninterrupted movement, there was a clarity she had not always known. A sense that nothing behind her needed to be revisited, nothing needed to be reclaimed, because everything she had once lost had already been transformed into something entirely her own, something no one else could define, and as the city unfolded ahead of her, she did not look back, because the story that once held her had already ended, and the one that remained was finally hers to write. The city moved around her in a steady rhythm, traffic lights changing, pedestrians crossing, conversations rising and fading as the car carried Charlotte forward, and she watched it all through the window without focusing on any single detail, allowing the motion itself to settle her, to anchor her in the present rather than the past she had just left behind, and for a while she said nothing, did nothing, simply existing in the quiet space between what had ended and what was still unfolding. Her hand resting gently over her stomach, feeling the subtle reassurance of life continuing, steady and certain, and it grounded her more than anything else could, because no contract, no room, no person had ever held that kind of meaning, and as the car turned onto a quieter street, lined with trees that softened the sharp edges of the city, her reflection shifted faintly in the glass, merging with the passing scenery, and for a moment she saw not just who she was now, but the path that had brought her here, the night she had spent alone, rebuilding something no one else could see, the decisions made without applause, without validation, the quiet determination that had replaced doubt piece by piece until there was nothing left to question, and she did not dwell on it for long, because she had learned that strength did not need to be revisited to be real, it simply existed in what came next. And as the car slowed to a stop in front of a modest but elegant building, the kind that did not announce itself but carried a quiet sense of permanence, the driver stepped out and opened the door once more, and Charlotte paused for a brief second before stepping onto the sidewalk, her movements composed, unhurried, as if there was nowhere else she needed to be, and inside, the lobby was warm, understated, a contrast to the sharp, polished space she had left earlier, and the receptionist greeted her with a soft smile that held no recognition of who she had been in that other world, only acknowledgement of who she was in this one, and Charlotte returned it with a slight nod before moving toward the elevator, her steps lighter now, not because anything had changed in that moment, but because everything already had, and when she reached her floor and stepped into the apartment, the door closing quietly behind her, the silence that greeted her was not empty, it was full, filled with the life she had built, the choices she had made, the space that belonged entirely to her, and she let herself stand there. For a moment, taking it in, the soft light filtering through the windows, the familiar textures, the sense of calm that did not need to be earned or defended, and as she moved further inside, her hand brushing lightly along the back of a chair, the edge of a table, grounding herself in the physical reality of it all, her phone vibrated softly in her bag, a reminder that the world outside had not stopped, that there were still conversations waiting, reactions unfolding, consequences settling into place, but she did not reach for it immediately, she did not feel the urgency she once would have, because for the first time, she understood that she did not need to respond to any of it right away, that the outcome had already spoken for itself, and as she finally placed her bag down and exhaled slowly, the quiet settling deeper around her, there was no rush to define what came next, no need to prove anything further, because whatever happened beyond this moment would not change what had already been decided, and Charlotte, standing in the space she had built on her own, knew with a clarity that required no words that she had not just walked away from the past, she had outgrown it entirely. The silence in the apartment did not remain untouched for long, it shifted, softened by the faint vibration of her phone against the table where she had placed it, the sound subtle but persistent, a quiet reminder that the world outside had already begun to react to what had happened, and Charlotte glanced at it without moving closer at first, as if deciding whether this moment required interruption, but she already knew the answer, not because she was avoiding it, but because she no longer needed to meet urgency with urgency, and when she finally stepped toward it, her movements remained unhurried, composed, the same steady rhythm she had carried with her all day, and the screen lit up beneath her fingertips, a stream of messages, missed calls, notifications layered one over the other, names she recognized, numbers she did not, all carrying the same underlying question without needing to ask it directly. And for a moment she simply observed it, not overwhelmed, not drawn in, just aware, because this was what followed moments like the one she had created, not noise, but consequence, not chaos, but recalibration, and she unlocked the phone, her thumb moving with quiet precision as she scrolled through the messages, her expression unchanged, absorbing without reacting, until one message held her attention just slightly longer than the rest, a single line from a number she had not saved, but did not need to. "We need to talk," and for a brief second, something old flickered at the edges of her awareness, not emotion exactly, but recognition, the familiarity of a tone that once carried weight, once dictated response, once pulled her into conversation she was not ready to have, and she let that moment exist without pushing it away, without holding on to it either, simply acknowledging that it was there, and then letting it pass. Because the difference now was not in what he said, but in what it meant to her, and it no longer held the same power, it no longer defined her next step, and she set the phone back down without replying, the decision quiet, but absolute, because there was nothing left to discuss that had not already been resolved, not in words, not in explanations, but in actions that could not be undone. And as she moved away from the table, the light from the window shifted slightly, casting a softer glow across the room, the afternoon beginning its slow transition into evening, and Charlotte stepped toward the window, her gaze drifting outward, watching the city stretch beyond her, alive and constant, filled with movement that did not pause for individual stories, no matter how significant they felt in the moment, and she rested her hand once more over her stomach, the gesture instinctive now, grounding her in something that existed entirely separate from everything else, something that did not require validation or acknowledgement to be real. And as she stood there, the weight of the day did not settle on her the way it once might have, it did not press in or demand release, it simply existed as something completed, something she had moved through with intention, and behind her, the phone vibrated again, another message, another attempt to reach her, but she did not turn back this time, did not feel the need to check, because she already understood what it represented, and more importantly, what it no longer did. And as the light continued to shift, the city beginning to glow with the first signs of evening, Charlotte remained where she was, steady, composed, her reflection faintly visible in the glass, a woman no longer waiting for answers, no longer defined by questions, but standing firmly in a space she had created entirely on her own, and in that quiet, unspoken certainty, there was nothing left for anyone else to take from her, and nothing left she needed to prove. The city lights began to rise one by one, small points of brightness spreading across the skyline as the last traces of daylight faded, and Charlotte remained by the window, her reflection blending with the glass, no longer separate from the world outside but quietly part of it, and there was a stillness in her now that did not come from exhaustion or relief, but from something deeper, something settled, as if every question that had once followed her had finally lost its voice, and she did not need to turn away from the past because it no longer stood behind her in the same way, it no longer reached for her, no longer asked to be understood or revisited, it simply existed as something completed, and in its place was a clarity she had not always known how to recognize, the kind that did not demand celebration or acknowledgement, only acceptance, and her phone remained on the table behind her, silent now, the earlier urgency having faded into something distant and irrelevant, because there were no conversations left that could change what had already been done, no explanations that needed to be offered, and no version of the past that could be rewritten, and she understood that now in a way that did not require effort, in a way that felt as natural as the steady rhythm of her breathing, and she placed her hand once more over her stomach, the gesture familiar, grounding, a quiet connection to something that was not defined by contracts or power or perception, something that existed entirely outside of those things, and as she stood there, she allowed herself to feel it fully, not as a contrast to what she had left behind, but as the center of what remained, the part of her life that did not need to be proven or defended, only lived, and the room around her held that truth without question, the soft light, the quiet space, the absence of expectation, and for a moment she closed her eyes, not to escape, but to settle deeper into it, to let the silence speak in a way words never could. And when she opened them again, the reflection looking back at her was no longer shaped by anything she had lost, but by everything she had built in its place, and there was no hesitation in it, no uncertainty, only a calm certainty that extended beyond the moment, beyond the day, into whatever came next, and she turned from the window slowly, her movements unhurried, the space around her responding in quiet familiarity, and as she moved further into the apartment, there was no sense of ending, no dramatic closure. Only continuation, the kind that did not need to announce itself to be real, and somewhere beyond the walls, the city continued, unchanged and constant, but within this space, within her, something had shifted in a way that would not be undone, not by memory, not by regret, not by anyone who had once believed they could define her. And as the light settled fully into evening, casting soft shadows across the room, Charlotte did not look back, because there was nothing left behind that still belonged to her, and nothing ahead that required her to prove she deserved it. And in that quiet, unwavering certainty, the story did not end with what she had taken or what she had left behind, but with what she had become, something no one else could diminish, something no one else could claim. And as the world moved on around her, she did the same, not with urgency, not with hesitation, but with a calm, steady resolve that required no witness, because the truth of it was already complete, and she had never needed revenge to win, only the strength to become something greater than the past that once tried to hold her there.